Japan didn't just occupy Korea. They tried to erase it from existence. And the worst part, much of the world simply looked away. For 35 years, Korea disappeared from the map. An entire nation, with thousands of years of history, was swallowed by Imperial Japan. What happened during those dark decades shaped modern East Asia in ways we're still seeing today. The scars haven't healed, and the stories from this period aren't just history. They're the living trauma that continues to fuel tensions between two powerful Asian nations. When we look at the map of Asia today, we see North and South Korea as distinct countries with their own identities. But between 1910 and 1945, Korea as a nation ceased to exist. It was completely absorbed into the Japanese Empire during a period that Koreans called the Dark Time. The problem facing Korean people wasn't just military occupation, it was complete cultural deletion. Japan didn't just want Korea's land and resources, it wanted to transform Koreans into Japanese subjects. This meant destroying Korean identity at its roots, through banning the Korean language, forcing people to adopt Japanese names, and rewriting history books to claim Korea had always been part of Japan. To understand how Korea fell under Japanese control, we need to go back to the late 19th century. For centuries, Korea had been known as the Hermit Kingdom, a fiercely independent nation that limited contact with the outside world. But by the 1870s, the old order in East Asia was crumbling. In 1876, Japan forced Korea to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa, opening Korean ports to Japanese trade. This was Korea's first modern treaty with a foreign power, and it marked the beginning of Japan's growing influence. At this time, Korea was still technically a tributary state of China's Qing dynasty, caught between modernizers who wanted Japanese help and traditionalists loyal to China. The rivalry peaked during the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Japan's surprising victory shattered China's influence in Korea. Then, 10 years later, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, eliminating the last major power standing between Japan and control of Korea. In 1905, Japan declared Korea a protectorate, taking control of Korean foreign affairs. 5 years later, on August 22, 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. The last Korean emperor, Sunjong, was removed from power, and Korea became Joseon, a colony of Japan. The 500-year-old Joseon Dynasty in Korean independence was over. The first decade of Japanese rule, from 1910 to 1919, is known as the Dark Period, or military police reign. The Japanese governor-general ruled with absolute power, backed by a brutal police force and military. Koreans lost basic rights overnight. Free speech vanished. Political organizations were banned. Newspapers were shut down. The Japanese police could arrest anyone without cause. The new colonial regime immediately began restructuring Korean society. They conducted land surveys that ultimately transferred much of Korea's agricultural land to Japanese ownership. By the 1930s, nearly half of Korea's rice production was being exported to Japan, while many Koreans went hungry. Education was transformed to serve Japanese interests. School curricula were redesigned to emphasize Japanese language and culture. Korean history was either deleted or distorted to portray Japan as Korea's natural ruler and savior. Korean students were forced to attend Shinto ceremonies, violating the religious beliefs of many Korean Christians and Buddhists. Life for ordinary Koreans changed dramatically under occupation. Many Korean farmers who had worked their family land for generations suddenly became tenants, paying high rents to absentee Japanese landlords. In the cities, a new industrial economy emerged, but with a racial hierarchy. Japanese owned the factories and held management positions, while Koreans worked as laborers for much lower wages. By the 1930s, a Korean factory worker typically earned only 30 to 50% of what a Japanese worker received for the same job. Housing was segregated, with Japanese living in modern districts with electricity and running water, while Koreans were crowded into older neighborhoods with poor infrastructure. In Seoul, renamed Kiju by the Japanese, this separation was visibly marked by the grand Japanese-built structures of the Colonial Center, contrasting with traditional Korean neighborhoods. For Korean children, education became a daily experience of cultural subjugation. In Japanese-run schools, students were forbidden to speak Korean, even during breaks. They were taught distorted history, claiming that Korea had always been dependent on foreign powers and needed Japan's guidance to modernize. Korean women faced particular hardships. Young women were recruited to work in textile factories under harsh conditions. As Japan's wars expanded, thousands of Korean women were forced into sexual slavery as comfort women for Japanese troops. A historical wound that remains unhealed today. Even nature itself was transformed. The Japanese conducted extensive logging operations that deforested much of Korea's mountains. By 1942, it's estimated that Korea had lost nearly 35% of its forest cover compared to 1910 levels, causing soil erosion, flooding, and damage to traditional agriculture. The colonial authorities tightly controlled information. Korean language newspapers were either shut down or placed under strict censorship. Books in Korean were increasingly restricted. Radio broadcasts were in Japanese. On March 1, 1919, everything changed. In Seoul's Pagoda Park, 33 Korean cultural and religious leaders signed and read aloud a Korean Declaration of Independence. This sparked nationwide protests that became known as the March 1st movement. What made this remarkable was its scale and nature. Across the country, approximately 2 million Koreans, about 10% of the entire population, participated in over 1,500 demonstrations. People from all walks of life joined. Students, farmers, laborers, merchants, and religious leaders. Most significantly, these were peaceful protests. Demonstrators carried Korean flags and shouted "Men say, long live Korean independence." But they were instructed to remain non-violent, even when confronted by authorities. The Japanese response was anything but peaceful. Colonial police and military fired on unarmed crowds. They burned villages and churches where protesters gathered. In one notorious incident at Jamre, Japanese police locked villagers in a church and burned it to the ground. The official Japanese count admitted to 553 Koreans killed and over 12,000 arrested, but Korean sources put the death toll at over 7,000, with more than 45,000 arrested. The March 1st movement ultimately failed to gain independence, but it transformed Korean resistance and Japanese colonial policy. It brought Koreans together, no matter their background. The Korean Provisional Government was established in Shanghai, serving as an exiled government until 1945. For Japan, the international embarrassment of the brutal crackdown forced colonial authorities to shift tactics. Admiral Makoto took over from Governor-General Hasegawa and introduced cultural rule, a sneaky way of controlling things while pretending to give a little cultural freedom. Under this policy, Koreans were permitted limited press freedom. Korean language newspapers were allowed to publish again, though under strict censorship. But these concessions were largely cosmetic. The goal was to split Korean society by bringing some people into the colonial system, while leaving resistors out in the cold. The resistance took many forms. In the countryside, armed guerrilla groups operated from mountain hideouts. In cities, student groups organized secret societies dedicated to preserving Korean language and culture. Korean communities abroad became crucial to the resistance. In Manchuria, the Korean Independence Army fought alongside Chinese forces against Japan. The Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai served as both a symbol of Korean sovereignty and a coordinator for resistance activities. Religion became another front of resistance. Many Korean Christians refused to participate in Shinto ceremonies that the Japanese made mandatory, seeing them as idolatry. Churches became centers of Korean identity preservation, with ministers often serving as community leaders in the resistance. Perhaps most powerful was the cultural resistance that preserved Korean identity. Families continued to speak Korean at home and secretly taught children the Korean alphabet. Traditional stories, songs, and customs were passed down orally when books were banned. Korean names were maintained in family records. Even as Japanese names were used in public, women played a crucial but often overlooked role in this cultural preservation. As primary caregivers, Korean mothers were responsible for teaching children their heritage in the privacy of homes. They maintained traditional food practices, religious observances, and language instruction that kept Korean identity alive for the next generation. The human cost of resistance was enormous. Japanese prisons filled with Korean political prisoners who faced torture and execution. The infamous Saidaman prison in Seoul became synonymous with brutality against Korean patriots. Colonial police used waterboarding, electric shocks, and other tortures to extract information about resistance networks. Everything changed again in the 1930s, as Japan's military ambitions in Asia expanded. After Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and full-scale war with China erupted in 1937, Korea's role shifted from colony to forward base for Japan's imperial expansion. In 1937, the colonial government launched the National Spiritual Mobilization movement, intensifying efforts to assimilate Koreans into Japanese culture. This policy, known as Naisan Itai, stated that Japan and Korea as one body. aimed to transform Koreans into loyal imperium subjects who would support Japan's war effort. The assimilation policy reached extreme levels. Korean language was banned from schools entirely. In 1939, the colonial government implemented the name change order, forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names. Those who refused faced severe consequences, including denial of food rations, expulsion from schools, and loss of employment. Korean men were drafted to work in factories and mines under harsh conditions. By the early 1940s, as Japan's war expanded across the Pacific, labor shortages led to forced conscription. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans were sent to Japan, Manchuria, and other territories to work in mines and factories supporting the war effort. Many never returned home. An estimated 200,000 Korean men were eventually conscripted into the Japanese military. Most served as laborers, but some saw combat, especially in the final desperate years of the war. Most heartbreaking was the fate of the comfort women. Thousands of Korean women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery for Japanese military forces. Many were tricked with promises of legitimate work or simply abducted. This issue remains one of the most painful legacies of the occupation period. As the Pacific War intensified after 1941, conditions in Korea deteriorated dramatically. Rice and other food products were confiscated in growing quantities to feed Japan's military and home population. By 1945, many Koreans were facing starvation. The war also brought American bombing to Korean soil. As U.S. forces pushed back Japanese forces in the Pacific, they began bombing industrial and military targets in Korea. Cities like Seoul, Pyongyang, and Wonsan suffered heavy damage. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to Allied forces. For Koreans, this day, known as Gwangbokjeol or Liberation Day, marked the end of 35 years of colonial rule. The joy of liberation was quickly complicated by new challenges. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces the south. This temporary division for accepting Japanese surrender would harden into the permanent division we know today. The different resistance factions had different visions for Korea's future. Leftist groups quickly organized people's committees across the country, while right-wing nationalists, many returning from exile, established competing power structures. The seeds of the Korean War, which would break out in 1950, were already being planted in the chaos of liberation. Perhaps the most powerful testament to Korean resilience comes from the Korean language itself. Despite 35 years of policies aimed at eliminating it, Korean not only survived but thrived after liberation. Today, Korean is spoken by over 75 million people. Korean popular culture, from K-dramas to K-pop, has captured global imagination. And the Korean alphabet Hangul, once banned in schools, is recognized as one of the world's most scientific writing systems. The Japanese occupation attempted to erase Korean identity from the inside out, to make Koreans forget who they were. Yet despite every effort, from banning the language to changing people's names, that identity endured. In the face of systematic cultural erasure, ordinary Koreans found ways to preserve their heritage, their stories, and their sense of self as a people. One elderly survivor, interviewed decades later, put it simply, "They took our country, they took our names, they even took the rice from our fields, but they could never take what was in our hearts." When Korean was banned in schools, grandparents became teachers, passing the alphabet and vocabulary to younger generations in secret. Family records kept Korean names alongside Japanese ones. Underground schools operated in remote villages, where children learned traditional Korean literature and history despite the risks. Even more remarkable is how quickly Korean cultural identity reasserted itself after liberation. Within days of Japan's surrender, Korean language signs appeared on businesses. Within weeks, Korean language newspapers were publishing. Within months, Korean schools were being established with curricula that celebrated rather than denigrated Korean history and traditions. The Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 represents one of history's most thorough attempts at cultural assimilation. For 35 years, Japan tried to transform Korea into an extension of itself through increasingly harsh policies that touched every aspect of Korean life. While the colonial period brought physical modernization to the peninsula, it came at an enormous human cost. Millions suffered from economic exploitation, cultural suppression, forced labor, and military conscription. The wounds from this period have shaped Korean national identity and continue to influence East Asian politics today. Yet the story of the occupation is also one of remarkable resilience. Despite overwhelming power imbalances and brutal repression, Korean resistance continued throughout the colonial period. From organized independence movements to the quiet defiance of ordinary people, preserving their language and customs, Koreans refused to surrender their identity. Today, both North and South Korea, despite their profound differences, share this historical memory. The occupation era remains a powerful reference point in Korean culture, education, and politics. Annual commemorations of the March 1st movement and Liberation Day keep this history alive for new generations. The legacy of the occupation continues to shape Korean society in complex ways. Issues like proper recognition and compensation for forced laborers and comfort women continue to strain diplomatic relations between Japan and Korea. The story of Korea's occupation and liberation reminds us that national identities cannot be erased by decree or force. It testifies to the resilience of human cultures and the fundamental human need for dignity and self-determination. And it stands as a warning about the lasting traumas that colonial domination inflicts. Wounds that take generations, not years, to heal. Korea was supposed to disappear. Its language, its history, its identity, wiped out. But the people refused. They fought, they endured, and they held on to their culture even when speaking their own names could get them punished. Today, Korea stands stronger than ever, its history not forgotten, but fueling its future. If you found this story as powerful as we did, make sure to subscribe to EpiVen for more hidden history the world tried to erase.